Thatcher found a severed tongue nailed to the mast of their drifting boat, still warm and twitching against the salt-crusted wood. It was a thick, muscular thing, glistening with a slick sheen that wasn't quite blood and wasn't quite seawater. It pulsed in a rhythmic, frantic thrum, like a landed fish gasping for an element it could no longer find. Thatcher did not scream. The air in the middle of the devil's throat was too heavy for screams. It sat in the lungs like wet wool, dampening sound until even the slap of the waves against the hull felt muffled, distant, and wrong. He reached out, his calloused fingers trembling inches from the pink, wet meat. He shouldn't have been out here. The charts said the throat was empty, a dead patch of ocean where the current stalled and the fish went blind. But Thatcher was a man possessed by a specific brand of grief, a jagged, unwashed hole in his chest left behind when Silas had vanished 3 weeks ago. Silas, his younger brother, who had spoken too much and feared too little. Silas, whose last words had been a joke about the singing tides. The boat, the Althea, groaned. It wasn't the sound of wood straining against wind. There was no wind. The sails hung limp and yellowed, like the skin of a jaundiced giant. The groan came from beneath the floorboards, a long, low vibration that rattled Thatcher's teeth. He pulled his hand back, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his brow. The sun was a pale, sickly disk behind a veil of gray mist, casting no shadows. In this light, the world looked unfinished. Thatcher's obsession flared. He had spent his life savings on this rotting vessel, convinced that Silas hadn't drowned. People didn't just drown in the throat, they were subtracted. He looked at the tongue again. It was nailed with a rusted iron spike, the metal weeping orange tears onto the deck. As he watched, the tip of the tongue curled upward, tasting the brine-heavy air. It was an inquisitive gesture, horribly human. "Silas?" Thatcher whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound that Thatcher could hear his own blood rushing through his own carotid artery. He could hear the microscopic friction of his eyelids blinking. Then the environment reacted. The mist didn't dissipate, it curdled. It thickened into oily ropes that draped themselves over the railing, smelling of old copper and deep trench rot. The water around the Althea stopped being water. It became a dark, viscous syrup, refusing to ripple, reflecting nothing but the white, blank stare of the sky. Thatcher moved toward the cabin, his boots sticking to the deck as if the wood were becoming adhesive. He needed to find a tool, a hammer, a pry bar, anything to remove that obscene thing from his mast. But his legs felt heavy, his joints filled with lead. Every step was a negotiation with a gravity that seemed to be pulling him not down, but inward. He remembered Silas's face the night he left, the way his brother's tongue had flicked over his lips as he described the treasure he thought was buried in the doldrums. Silas had always been a talker. He could weave a net out of nothing but rumors and hope. Thatcher had been the silent one, the anchor. Now the roles were reversed. Thatcher was drifting, and the silence was a weight he couldn't lift. He entered the cramped cabin. The smell hit him first. It was the scent of a crowded room, the humid breath of 1,000 people packed into a space meant for one. But the cabin was empty. His charts were spread across the table, their edges curling as if scorched by an invisible flame. He looked at the map of the devil's throat. The ink was running. The lines representing the coast were blurring, melting into the blue of the sea, until the paper was nothing but a smear of dark indigo. He found a rusted chisel in the tool drawer. When he gripped the handle, the cold of the iron bit into his palm, but he welcomed the pain. It was a tether to reality. He stepped back out onto the deck, and the light had changed again. The sickly yellow had been replaced by a bruised purple, the color of a fresh hematoma. The tongue on the mast was no longer twitching. It was rigid now, pointing straight at him like a fleshy compass needle. Thatcher froze. He felt a sudden sharp pressure behind his own teeth, a phantom ache that radiated up to his sinuses. His mouth filled with the taste of salt and iron. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt constricted, as if an invisible hand were tightening around his windpipe. The boat tilted. There was no wave to tilt it. The ocean remained a flat obsidian mirror. Yet the Althea leaned heavily to the starboard side, the mast creaking in protest. The severed tongue remained fixed, its tip tracking Thatcher as he compensated for the slant. It wasn't just meat, it was a witness. He realized then that the silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that had eaten all the sound. The wrong silence was a physical entity, a predator that had swallowed the gulls, the wind, and the engine's throb. And now it was looking for the last thing that could break it.
Thatcher's grip on the chisel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He looked at the mast, at the salt-crusted wood that seemed to be growing more porous, more like bone. He had come here to find his brother's voice, but the sea didn't give back what it took. It only repurposed it. The tongue gave one final violent spasm and then went limp, a grayish slime beginning to ooze from its base. Thatcher took a step forward, the chisel raised, but he stopped when he heard it. It wasn't a sound from the air, it was a sound from inside his own head. It was the sound of Silas's laughter, muffled as if through a mile of water, vibrating in the marrow of his bones. The mist pressed closer, the oily ropes now touching the hem of his trousers. The world was shrinking, the horizon dissolving into the purple gloom, leaving nothing but Thatcher, the boat, and the tasting muscle that knew exactly why he was here. He was the anchor, and the anchor was being dragged down. The compass needle did not spin, it wilted. Thatcher watched, paralyzed, as the thin sliver of magnetized steel softened like warm wax, drooping toward the glass casing until it pointed straight down, toward the belly of the Althea. There was no north here, there was only the depth. He reached for the throttle, desperate to coax the engine back to life, but his hand recoiled. The metal handle was no longer cold, it was feverish. When he squeezed it, the iron yielded with the sickening elasticity of a bruised fruit. The engine didn't sputter or cough. It let out a wet, rhythmic thrumming that felt less like a machine and more like a heartbeat struggling against a clot. Beneath his boots, the deck planks began to change. The seasoned oak, once hard and reassuring, now had the give of a waterlogged mattress, or perhaps, Thatcher thought with a rising bile, the soft palate of a giant. Every nail in the wood began to weep. A thick, translucent fluid, viscous as saliva, bubbled up around the rusted heads, pooling in the grooves of the floorboards. The boat wasn't leaking seawater, it was salivating. "Silas," Thatcher whispered, the name catching in his dry throat.
The response was immediate and wrong. The ropes coiled near the gunwale didn't just shift with the tide, they constricted. The hempen fibers frayed and thickened, taking on a slick, muscular sheen. They pulsed in time with the engine's subterranean heart, sliding across the deck like eyeless eels. One rope brushed against Thatcher's ankle, and he felt the unmistakable texture of wet velvet. It wasn't a rope, it was a length of muscle, seeking a grip. Thatcher lunged for the wheel, but the spokes had grown rounded and ivory white, textured with the jagged ridges of molars. He couldn't steer. The Althea had stopped being a vessel and had become an anatomy. He looked out at the water, hoping for the gray sanity of the Atlantic, but the sea had betrayed him too. The waves didn't break into white foam. They curled into heavy, fleshy folds that rose and fell in a sickening, rhythmic swallow. The mist wasn't mist anymore. It was a warm, humid breath that smelled of copper and old rot. He remembered the day Silas went overboard. He remembered the way the water hadn't splashed, but had seemed to open a mouth to receive him. Thatcher had reached out, his fingers brushing Silas's palm, but the sea had been faster. It had tasted Silas and found him wanting. Now it was tasting Thatcher. The chisel in his hand began to sweat. The steel blade turned porous, absorbing the gray slime from the deck until it became heavy, useless, and soft. He dropped it, and it didn't clatter. It landed with a dull thud, sinking inches into the now fleshy wood of the deck. A sound rose from the hold, a wet slapping noise, like 1,000 wet palms hitting a drum. The Althea was heaving, not from the waves, but from a gag reflex. The boat was trying to vomit him out or pull him deeper into its gullet. Thatcher looked back at the mast. The tongue was gone. In its place was a jagged hole in the wood, rimmed with what looked like white splintered bone. The hole was widening. It was a throat. The boat tilted sharply to the port side, and Thatcher felt the deck turn slick. The saliva was everywhere now, coating the wood, the railings, and his own skin. He slipped, his knees hitting the soft, pulsing floorboards. The vibration of Silas's laughter was no longer in his bones. It was coming from the wood itself. The boat was laughing at him. He looked at his hands. The salt-crusted skin was beginning to shine. His fingerprints were smoothing over, replaced by the same tiny pebbled bumps that covered the thing nailed to the mast. He tried to scream, but the air in his lungs felt heavy, like he was inhaling syrup.
The horizon had vanished. The sky and the sea were a single, bruised purple membrane that pressed in from all sides. The Althea groaned, a sound of stretching tendons and snapping ligaments. The mast leaned further, the wood splintering, not into shards, but into raw, red fibers. Thatcher realized then that he wasn't on a boat anymore. He was a piece of grit in a colossal mouth, and the mouth was beginning to close. The salt wasn't seasoning the wood, it was curing the meat. The first rope tendon coiled around his waist, not with the violence of a predator, but with the steady, inevitable pull of a tongue drawing food toward the back of a throat. The Althea began to sink, not into the water, but into itself. The first tooth breached the floorboards near the stern. It was not white like a human's, but a yellow, jagged slab of ivory the size of a tombstone, slick with a thick, translucent bile that smelled of centuries-old rot. Thatcher scrambled back, his hand sinking into the deck. The wood didn't splinter, it yielded like wet foam. Beneath the thinning surface of the Althea, a great muscle surged. He could feel the peristaltic rhythm of the sea. No, the sea was gone. The world was a wet, dark cavity, and the boat was merely a hardening scab on a massive tongue. "Silas!" Thatcher's voice was a rasp, a dry rattle in a throat that felt increasingly crowded. He looked toward the mast. The severed tongue he had found earlier was no longer nailed there. It had fused with the wood, its pinkish flesh spreading like a lichen, veins niving into the grain of the mast. The mast itself was bowing, softening into a giant vertical uvula that vibrated with every heave of the invisible lungs below. Thatcher tried to stand, but his boots were being absorbed. The leather had begun to melt, bonding with the deck's sticky, organic sludge. He saw a shape huddled near the bow. It was Silas, But Silas was wrong. His friend sat cross-legged, his back turned, his shoulders jerking in a rhythmic, terrifying motion. "Silas, we have to jump!" Thatcher choked out. He looked over the railing. There was no water. Below the boat stretched a vast, pink plain of undulating flesh, dotted with thousands of shimmering white shapes. They weren't waves, they were teeth, millions of them, rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic chew. Silas turned. His face was a smooth, featureless mask of skin. His eyes were gone, buried under a layer of pebbled growth. His mouth, however, was wide, unnaturally wide, stretching from ear to ear, held open by splintered ribs of wood. Inside Silas's mouth, a second, smaller tongue flickered, miming the movements of a frantic animal. "You can't jump, Thatcher," Silas said. The voice didn't come from his throat. It vibrated out of the very air, resonating from the Althea's ribs. "The salt doesn't let you leave. It only preserves the story." Thatcher felt a sharp, stinging heat behind his teeth. He reached into his mouth and pulled. His own tongue felt heavy, foreign, and coated in a crystalline grit. He realized then the rule of this place, the knowledge horror that turned his blood to ice. In the tide of tongues, nothing is ever lost. Every lie, every scream, every whispered secret uttered at sea is caught here. The salt doesn't kill, it cures. It crystallizes the words and gives them meat. To be on the Althea was not to be a passenger, but to be a vessel for a specific, unfinished sentence. "The boat needs a speaker, Thatcher," the Silas thing whispered, its wooden-ribbed mouth twitching. "The sea is a mouth that has forgotten to talk. It uses us to remember the words." Thatcher looked down at his hands. His fingernails were falling out, and in their place, tiny sharp tips of bone were emerging. His skin was no longer skin. It was the same pale, tasteless muscle as the floorboards. He remembered the guilt he had carried for Silas, the way he had stayed silent when the storm hit, the way he had watched the boom swing toward Silas's head and said nothing because he was too afraid to move. That silence was now harvested.
The Althea groaned, and the wood of the deck curled upward like a closing eyelid. Thatcher realized the boat wasn't sinking. It was being swallowed by the very thing it had become. The ropes, the tendons tightened around his chest. They weren't trying to drown him. They were trying to pull him down into the subdeck, into the gullet where the other stories waited. He saw them now, peering through the gaps in the softening floorboards. Hundreds of faces, their features blurred and smoothed over, their mouths all stitched open with rusted rigging. They were the chorus. They were the texture of the throat. They were the ones who had remained silent when they should have spoken, and now they were forced to hum the same low, vibrating note for eternity to keep the great mouth from closing. "I didn't mean to let it hit you," Thatcher screamed, his voice breaking into a wet sob. "The tide doesn't care about meaning," Silas replied, his body beginning to dissolve into the mast. "It only cares about the sound. Give it your tongue, Thatcher. Give it the word you held back." The salt crust on Thatcher's skin thickened, turning into a hard, calcified shell. He felt his jaw hinge backward, the bone snapping with a sound like a dry branch. His tongue began to swell, growing larger and larger until it filled his entire oral cavity, pressing against his teeth until they shattered. The rule was absolute. The sea demands a debt of speech. If you do not give it your words, it takes the instrument. The Althea gave a final wet shudder. The mast uvula dropped, the deck tongue rose, and the world became a suffocating darkness of warm, pulsing muscle. Thatcher felt the first digestive enzyme touch his legs, not burning, but tingling with the sensation of 1,000 needles. He wasn't being eaten, he was being integrated. He was becoming a syllable in the long, wet history of the tide. He tried to think of his name, but the memory was being scrubbed away by the salt, replaced by a single, rhythmic vibration. The boat was gone. The sea was gone. There was only the hum. He was the salt crust on the wood.
The salt did not merely coat Thatcher, it rewrote the architecture of his nervous system. He was no longer a man standing upon a deck, but a crystalline layer of consciousness bonded to the shivering, muscular walls of the Althea. The boat had ceased to be a vessel of wood and iron. It was a throat, vast and wet, suspended in a sea that had long ago forgotten the taste of water, craving only the resonance of a human voice. The hum that Silas had become was everywhere now, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the calcium in Thatcher's teeth until they crumbled like wet chalk. Inside the pulsing dark of the great mouth, the concept of forward and backward dissolved into a singular rhythmic swallow. Thatcher felt the digestive enzymes of the tide beginning to weep through his skin. It wasn't an acid that burned the flesh, but a solvent that dissolved the boundaries of the self. He felt his memories leaking out of his pores, staining the pink, fleshy floor of the gullet. He saw his childhood, a flickering image of a red barn in a cold winter, bleed into the texture of the throat wall, becoming a pattern of veins that the ship beast used to breathe. Then the vibration changed. The hum of the collective tongues sharpened, focusing into a singular point of pressure against his sternum. The darkness didn't speak with a voice, but with a contraction. The entire world, this wet and suffocating space, squeezed him with the intimacy of a lover and the coldness of a butcher. Thatcher, the world vibrated. It wasn't a sound that entered his ears, it was a name that originated from within his own lungs, forced upward by the heaving of the deck tongue beneath him. The word felt heavy, coated in the copper tang of blood and the bitter sting of sea salt. "Thatcher," the tide repeated, and this time the walls of the throat rippled with the shape of Silas's face. 1,000 Silas faces, stretched thin like parchment, emerged from the muscular lining of the Althea. Their eyes were clouded with salt, but their mouths were wide, moving in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic thrumming of the sea. "Thatcher, you always were so quiet, Thatcher. Even when the rope frayed, even when the winch slipped, you watched the weight fall and you didn't say a word." Thatcher tried to scream, but he had no lungs left to push the air. He was a film of salt and a memory of pain. He looked down at where his hands should have been and saw only the white calcified crust of the mast, which was now a giant uvula dangling above the abyss. He realized with a jolt of pure, cold terror that the horror wasn't just consuming him, it was auditing him. The tide of tongues was a ledger of every unspoken truth, every cowardice cloaked in silence. It knew the exact weight of the secret he had carried since the day the dock had groaned under the weight of his father's debt. It knew the name of the girl he had let drown, because calling for help would have meant admitting he was where he shouldn't have been.
"You thought the silence was yours to keep," the walls whispered, the voices of the integrated crew blending into a discordant choir. "But silence is a loan from the sea, and the interest is paid in meat." A sudden, violent contraction threw Thatcher's consciousness deeper into the dark. The walls of the Althea, the throat, began to narrow. The rhythmic swallowing intensified, the wet muscle pressing against his salt-hardened form until he could feel the individual fibers of the ship's being. He wasn't being digested for fuel, he was being curated. He saw the other tongues now, millions of them, lining the inner walls of the great mouth like grotesque shingles. Each one was a person who had chosen silence over truth, now forced to serve as a taste bud for the ocean's eternal hunger. The horror knew him. It didn't just want a tongue, it wanted the specific flavor of Thatcher's silence. It wanted the particular bitterness of his regret. "Open up, Thatcher," the Silas faces moaned, their collective voice a wet slosh against the darkness. "The tide wants to hear you finally say it. Give us the word that killed us." He felt his jaw being forced open by invisible muscular hands. The salt crust cracked, exposing the raw, pulsing nerves beneath. His tongue, now a bloated, sentient thing of its own, began to thrash in the cage of his mouth. It wanted to join its brothers on the wall. It wanted to be nailed to the mast. It wanted to be part of the long, wet history of the silence that drowns the world. The ship gave a final, agonizing lurch. Thatcher felt his identity snap. He was no longer a man named Thatcher who had once lived on land. He was a syllable of guilt being slowly rolled toward the back of a cosmic throat. The realization hit him with the weight of a collapsing wave. He would never die. Death was a luxury for those who had spoken. For him, there was only the eternal integration, the slow dissolution into the texture of a god's gullet. He looked up, or where up used to be, and saw the last glimmer of the moon through the closing ring of the Althea's mouth. It was a pale, uncaring eye. Then the muscle closed. The world became a pressurized chamber of rhythmic, humming meat. The silence he had guarded so carefully was now the very thing that would scream for eternity within the salt. He was the flavor of the debt. The floorboards of the Althea no longer groaned under Thatcher's weight. They yielded. They were soft, spongy, and radiated a low, feverish heat that pulsed against the soles of his boots. The transition from wood to wet, fibrous tissue was complete. Where the mast had once stood as a pillar of cedar, there was now a vertical column of stacked, calcified vertebrae rising toward a sky that had turned the bruised purple of a fresh hematoma. The air was thick, not with the mist of the sea, but with the humid, copper-heavy breath of a gargantuan throat. Thatcher tried to move his hands, but they were being stitched into the railings by fine, silver threads of saliva that hardened upon contact with the air. He looked down at his chest. His flannel shirt was being consumed by a fast-growing lichen of taste buds. They flickered like tiny, pale flames, tasting the sweat and the terror that leaked from his pores. He was no longer a passenger or a captain. He was an irritant being slowly coated in the pearl matter of a cosmic hunger. The silence he had maintained since the night Silas slipped into the black water was now a physical weight, a stone in his stomach that was being dragged upward by the tide. It wasn't just his silence, it was the collective weight of every word never spoken, every apology withheld, and every lie allowed to fester in the dark corners of the world. The tide of tongues was the graveyard of the unsaid, and it had finally come to collect its most prized silence. "It's not so bad, Thatcher," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the Silas faces in the dark. It came from Thatcher's own throat, though his mouth remained fused shut. The salt preserves the memory. You won't forget a single second of the way he looked at you before the waves took him. Thatcher's eyes rolled back as the Althea began to swallow itself. The ship was folding inward, the bow and stern curving up like the lips of a closing wound. He felt his ribs begin to soften and widen, flattening out to match the curvature of the hull. His nervous system was being rewired, his synapses sparking as they merged with the ship's own frantic bioluminescent network. He could feel the pressure of the deep ocean, but it wasn't pressing against the boat. It was pressing against his own skin. He was the hull. He was the deck. He was the very vessel of his own damnation. The realization of his eternal state arrived with a cold, clinical clarity. There would be no drowning. The lungs that were now integrated into the bilge pumps did not need oxygen. They processed guilt. He would exist in this pressurized state of mid-transformation forever, suspended in the moment between the scream and the silence. He looked toward the mast, where the first tongue had been nailed. The nail was still there, but the tongue was gone. In its place was a vacant, waiting space. He felt a sharp, rhythmic tugging at the root of his own tongue. It was being reeled in by an invisible line, pulled toward that singular, rusted point of focus. The ship gave a final wet heave, and the world outside the Althea vanished. There was no more moon, no more horizon, only the interior of a vast, churning stomach made of salt and regret. Thatcher saw the others now, thousands of them, not just Silas, but men and women from every century, their bodies flattened and stretched into the architecture of 1,000 different ghost ships, all drifting in this sunless, internal sea. They were the planks, the sails, and the rigging of a fleet that served only to transport the silence of the dead. Each one was a monument to a secret. He felt the iron spike press against the back of his throat. It was cold, and it smelled of the same salt that had crusted over his life. There was no pain, only a profound sense of placement. He was being fitted into the only gear where he truly belonged. His identity, the name Thatcher, the memory of his home, the smell of dry earth, all of it was being bleached away by the digestive enzymes of the tide. He was becoming a texture. He was becoming a sensory input for a god that fed on the bitterness of the human heart. As the spike drove through the meat of him, pinning his last essence to the mast of the Althea, the rhythmic humming of the ship reached a deafening crescendo. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a vibration that told him the debt was settled. The silence he had guarded was no longer his to keep. It was now a permanent part of the ocean's roar, a single jagged note in an eternal, wordless scream. The darkness was absolute, warm and heavy, smelling of old blood and the deep, unforgiving salt. He was finally part of the conversation.